Surely, all of us have witnessed, either through a screen or in real life, the terrifying destruction that a flood can bring. The murky water sweeps away everything in its path. Collapsed homes, uprooted trees, torn up roads, and most tragically, lives lost beneath the waves. When nature's fury subsides, it leaves behind a scene of devastation and heartbreaking stories of those who never returned. But sometimes, amid the wreckage, people uncover things even more horrifying than the flood itself, dark secrets long buried. And in 1980 in Ecuador, such a discovery sent chills through the entire world. In 1980, torrential rains hit Ecuador, causing severe flooding in many areas, including the city of Ambato. The rising waters swept away homes, crops, and claimed the lives of hundreds. When the storm finally passed, rescue teams immediately began searching for the missing victims. They hoped to return the bodies to their families for identification and proper burial. However, among the mud and debris left by the flood, rescuers accidentally uncovered a horrifying clue, a dark secret about one of the most brutal killers in Colombia's history. The truth gradually emerged, turning the recovery mission into an investigation into a series of crimes hidden for years. At first, no one suspected anything when 4 bodies were discovered in the flood's aftermath. They were assumed to be unfortunate victims of the natural disaster, swept away by the violent current. But when investigators arrived at the scene, they noticed something strange. Someone appeared to have deliberately hidden the bodies. This suggested that the incident was no longer merely a natural tragedy, but the sign of a gruesome crime. Experts tried to determine the cause of death, but the floodwaters had washed away all evidence, leaving them at a dead end. It seemed this mystery would remain unsolved forever, but just a few days later, the police received an unexpected lead. At the end of April that year, in a supermarket, a 12-year-old girl named Maria Carvina was nearly abducted by a stranger in the middle of a crowd. When the man suddenly grabbed the girl's hand and tried to pull her away, her mother screamed frantically for help. Bystanders quickly intervened, restraining the man until the police arrived. No one could have guessed that this seemingly minor incident would help uncover a horrifying crime hidden for years. Local police promptly arrived to arrest the man. Once brought to headquarters for questioning, they immediately asked him about any connection to the recently discovered bodies. However, he stubbornly remained silent, refusing to answer any of his questions, clearly showing an uncooperative attitude. At first, the investigators thought he might be mentally unstable, as he only gave a mysterious smile and occasionally looked away as if he didn't care about his situation. An entire hour passed, and all attempts to extract information were in vain. He didn't utter a single word. Realizing they couldn't continue like this, the investigators decided to change tactics. They thought that perhaps a priest might be able to reach the suspect psychologically and make him confess. So they sought out Father Cordoba. pleased when stating that he preferred Ecuadorian girls because they were said to be gentler, more trusting, and more naive, unlike the more cautious Colombian girls. These statements not only reveal his perverse and inhuman nature, but also highlight the dangerous mindset of serial killers who may view people, especially their victims, as vulnerable objects to fulfill their twisted desires. This underscores one of the most frightening traits of homicidal criminals: their emotional detachment and discriminatory perception of victims, whom they see merely as easy prey. As the investigation delved into Pedro Alonso López's past, a tragic childhood gradually came to light, offering possible explanations for his criminal behavior. Pedro Alonso López was born on October 8, 1948, in Tolima, Colombia, during a time when the country was engulfed in a brutal civil war, with violence and unrest lurking around every corner. From birth, his life was surrounded by poverty, violence, and the looming shadow of abuse. The painful memories of his childhood likely left deep psychological scars, which may have contributed to his distorted thinking and transformation into a cold-blooded killer. His father died in a bar fight just 6 months before he was born. His mother, Hilda López de Castañeda, made a living as a sex worker in their cramped home. She had a total of 13 children, each with a different father, and they were all crammed into a single small room. Her private encounters with clients were separated only by a thin curtain, and Pedro, from a young age, was forced to witness these disturbing scenes. He later recalled that his mother showed no concern for her children, and when she did pay attention to them, it was only to beat or abuse them. The breaking point came in 1957, when Pedro was 9 years old, and his mother caught him attempting to sexually abuse his own younger sister. From that moment on, he became a street child, drifting aimlessly, scavenging for food from trash bins, and roaming through crime-ridden areas. It was in this environment that his fate began to take an even darker turn than ever before. After several days wandering the streets, Pedro Alonso López was fortunate to meet a kind elderly man. The man took him home, gave him food, and provided a temporary place for him to stay. To Pedro at that time, the old man felt like a lifeline in the middle of a raging sea, the only person who seemed willing to help him, offering a small glimpse of hope in his chaotic and uncertain life. However, what Pedro thought was a rescue turned out to be a nightmare. Instead of taking him to a safe home, the old man led him to an abandoned, desolate, and dark building. Within just a few days, the old man revealed his true nature, repeatedly beating and cruelly abusing Pedro. Pedro was forced to stay in that house, tied up in a dark room where the old man would occasionally return to do terrifying things, making Pedro feel like prey being hunted. After many days of captivity and unbearable abuse, Pedro could no longer endure the physical and mental torture. When the old man realized Pedro had nothing left to give, he decided to let him go, as if releasing a caged wild beast. However, this did not bring true liberation for Pedro. On the contrary, the prolonged confinement, cruelty, and deprivation etched a deep and boundless sense of anger and hatred into his mind. The emotional wounds never healed. Instead, they grew heavier over time, making him aggressive, cold-hearted, and devoid of compassion or mercy. He had become a different person, one whose hatred and rage gradually became the primary driving force of his life. In the battle for survival, he learned how to fight with knives and began smoking and using drugs at an early age. After wandering for more than a year, he decided to head to the city of Bogotá, where he believed his fate might change. And indeed, his life took a major turn. One day, an American found Pedro on the street, and after speaking with him and seeing that he was a polite young man trapped in a tragic, wandering life, they decided to adopt him. At that time, Pedro was just 12 years old, and his life took a completely different turn. For the first time, he had a family, a real home. He was able to attend school like other children and make new friends. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, giving him hope for a brighter future. However, fate was not done with him yet. One day, a teacher whom he trusted turned out to be the person who delivered the greatest shock of his life. The teacher took advantage of Pedro's innocence, left him in a state of utter panic, and stole the little money he had. Hurt and disillusioned, Pedro ran away once more, returning to the dangerous streets he had once tried so hard to leave behind. This time, Pedro was determined to find a job to support himself, hoping to become independent and no longer rely on anyone. But due to his lack of experience, he was repeatedly turned away. With no other options left, Pedro fell into a life of crime, starting with petty theft. At first, he only carried out simple thefts and was caught by the police several times. However, because he was still young, he was often released without facing serious consequences. Over time, Pedro became a well-known car thief, clever, quick, and exceptionally skilled. He caught the attention of stolen car dealers who began regularly hiring him for bigger jobs. The path he had chosen led him deeper into the underworld, where the line between right and wrong slowly began to blur. In 1969, when Pedro turned 21, he was arrested by the police in a suburb of Bogotá and sentenced to 7 years in prison. In 1969, when Pedro turned 21, he was arrested by the police in a suburb of Bogotá and sentenced to 7 years in prison. They beat and abused him mercilessly, but instead of being afraid or passively enduring it, Pedro began to harbor a desire for revenge. Not long after, Pedro crafted a knife using materials available in the prison. Just 2 weeks after being abused, he struck back, killing each of his abusers one by one with chilling brutality. That was the moment he realized that killing not only satisfied his need for revenge, but also gave him a strange sense of pleasure. This act earned him an additional 2 years in prison, but since it was considered self-defense, the punishment was not severe. Throughout his time in prison, Pedro's hatred toward his mother grew increasingly intense. Combined with constant exposure to pornographic magazines, he began to develop a distorted perception of women. Gradually, he transformed himself into someone consumed by hatred, ready to turn the dark thoughts in his mind into real actions. In 1978, after completing his prison sentence, he showed no signs of remorse or change. On the contrary, he had fully transformed into a dangerous predator. No longer a victim, he was now the one hunting for prey. He began a journey across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, searching for vulnerable girls whom he could easily manipulate. During his wanderings, he discovered that girls between the ages of 8 and 12 were the easiest victims to approach. They often wandered alone, unprotected. Especially in indigenous tribal areas of Ayacucho, southern Peru, he exploited the trust of young girls, luring them with promises of jobs or gifts and convincing them to follow him to remote places. Once they reached a secluded location, he carried out his brutal acts before eliminating the victims to leave no trace behind. The continuous disappearance of young girls in the area struck fear into the local indigenous population. They believed a monster was hunting their children, and thus, the name the Monster of the Andes was born. However, his luck couldn't last forever. One day, while attempting to kidnap a 9-year-old girl, he was captured by a group of tribal villagers in northern Peru. They didn't hand him over to the police right away, but decided to punish him themselves. For days, they tortured him with brutal methods, burying him up to his neck, beating him mercilessly, and even smearing honey on his body to attract ants. Just when he was on the brink of death, an American missionary, who was a friend to the villagers, persuaded them that killing him in such a way was no better than barbarism. Eventually, under pressure from this woman, the tribe decided to turn him over to local authorities. After being tortured by the villagers and handed over to the authorities, he wasn't put on trial or severely punished. Instead, he was released at the Colombian border. According to journalistic sources, Peruvian police felt pity and didn't want to invest resources into investigating the disappearances. However, other sources claim that the missionary handed him over to the police, who simply refused to take responsibility and let him go free. After escaping danger, Pedro not only refused to change his ways but continued his horrific acts in a more organized manner. He was especially obsessed with the eyes of young girls under the sunlight. He enjoyed watching the light fade from their innocent eyes, a moment he described as wonderful. Daytime was the perfect time for him to strike, as darkness would rob him of the experience he so deeply craved. Pedro became a notorious predator, wandering through plazas, markets, and neighborhoods, searching for the most innocent-looking girls. He often disguised himself as a street vendor, using small gifts to lure his victims, promising they could take them home as presents for their mothers. In reality, it was a trap, leading them down a road from which there was no return. Between 1978 and 1980, a large number of girls disappeared across Colombia and Ecuador. Yet the police had not suspected the presence of a serial killer. They believed the cases were related to human trafficking or ordinary disappearances. However, as the number of missing girls grew, an unexpected event in 1980 exposed the truth. A major flood in Ambato, Ecuador, washed away layers of soil, accidentally uncovering the bodies of 4 young girls. This marked a critical turning point, as just days later, Pedro made a serious mistake. While attempting to kidnap a 12-year-old girl, the victims screamed, drawing the attention of locals and police. He was arrested on the spot. During the investigation, Ecuadorian authorities were still not fully convinced they had caught a serial killer. To get a confession, an officer named Cordoba went undercover as an agent. He pretended to be the father of one of the victims to approach Pedro and gain his trust. The strategy worked. Pedro began recounting his crimes with pride, showing no sign of remorse. At first, investigators suspected he might be lying, much like the case of Henry Lee Lucas, who claimed an accomplice. He blamed a man named Jorge Patiño, insisting that Patiño was the real mastermind behind the crimes. According to Pedro, it was Patiño who had shown the police the burial sites, and without his notes, Pedro claimed he wouldn't have remembered the exact locations of the victims. Pedro Alonso López was held in Ecuador until 1994, serving 14 of his 16-year sentence due to good behavior. On the day of his release, he appeared overjoyed, shouting, dancing, and repeatedly thanking God for delivering him from prison. However, his joy was short-lived. Just 1 hour after leaving prison, he was rearrested for not having legal identification. The Ecuadorian authorities extradited him to Colombia under an existing request. In Colombia, he faced trial for the murder of 2 young girls in 1979. However, after a psychological evaluation, the judge concluded that he suffered from a mental disorder and was unfit to stand trial. In 1995, Pedro was committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. 5 years later, medical experts deemed him stable and eligible for release, on the condition that he continue psychological treatment and report to the court monthly. Before leaving the hospital, he openly admitted to a doctor that killing gave him a sense of excitement and ultimate satisfaction. He even stated that if he were ever completely free, he would kill again because it was his mission. After his release, Pedro traveled to a remote area in Tolima to visit his mother, who had previously begged authorities not to release him, fearing he would kill her. However, instead of harming her, he asked her to kneel and receive a blessing from him. After a brief conversation, Pedro demanded money to leave, forcing her to sell both her only bed and chair to give him what he wanted. He then vanished without a trace and has not been seen since. Thus, Pedro Alonso López, known as the Monster of the Andes, completely disappeared in 1998 after his final visit to his mother. According to previous psychological assessments, experts diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, a man without a conscience, lacking empathy, and highly skilled at manipulation and verbal deception. When speaking about his victims, he didn't refer to them as people he killed, but as little friends, companions he liked having around. He even recounted once gathering 3 or 4 girls just to talk, as if hosting a cheerful little get-together. In the beginning, each time he killed, he felt immense satisfaction, but once the victim stopped moving, he quickly lost interest and began searching for a new target. To him, the crime scenes were almost sacred, places of significance, even considered trophies. Some speculate that he may have even slept beside the corpses of his victims. In 2002, Interpol issued a warrant for Pedro Alonso López after identifying striking similarities between his method of killing and the murder of a young girl in Espinal, Colombia. The case led authorities to suspect López's involvement in earlier murders, as the crime patterns and victim profiles were nearly identical. Although he had been widely wanted, rumors about López only resurfaced in 2010 when someone claimed to have seen him visiting his mother. However, from that point on, he vanished once again without a trace. In an interview with the media, Pedro Alonso López's mother stated that she believed her son was still alive, although no solid evidence supported this claim. In 2012, a brutal murder occurred in the town of Tuña, Colombia, with a method eerily similar to the past crimes of the Monster of the Andes. This case led many to suspect that Pedro Alonso López might still be alive and continuing his brutal killing spree. This coincidence raised difficult questions. Was he still lurking in the shadows, or had his crimes truly come to an end? Could a silent criminal still be living among society, yet unidentified? Currently, Pedro Alonso López remains on Interpol's most wanted list, and no one knows where he is. If still alive, he would be around 77 years old, but he has long disappeared from law enforcement radar. Even so, no concrete evidence has ever confirmed López's claim of murdering 300 people. The number of victims he confessed to remains a mystery. While some believe he truly committed such atrocities, there is no definitive proof. Some theories even suggest he may have exaggerated or fabricated the numbers to gain attention. This case highlights a sad and painful truth about the uncertainties in criminal investigations. Despite having information, evidence, and suspicion, no conclusive answers have been found regarding the crimes Pedro Alonso López may have committed. It underscores a critical point. No matter how hard the justice system tries, some criminals manage to escape justice, leaving behind unanswerable questions. No two cases are the same, and each presents unforeseeable challenges that demand perseverance and skill from investigators. López, known as the Monster of the Andes, may still be living in the shadows, continuing to haunt those connected to the cases. This reflects a harsh reality. Sometimes, silence in investigations or lack of coordination between agencies enables criminals to remain hidden. Although the truth remains unclear, the case of Pedro Alonso López serves as a stark reminder of the importance of staying vigilant, persistent in investigations, and never giving up the pursuit of justice for innocent victims. The story of Pedro Alonso López stands as a warning, not just to authorities, but to all of us. We must protect our communities and never stop seeking justice, even when things seem to have gone quiet.